Good afternoon, and welcome to Money Matters. My name is Kimon Hatza, and I'm a business attorney at GrowthCounsel in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We're a business transaction boutique and represent companies across industries. I focus my practice in the areas of life sciences and technology. This afternoon, we're continuing our special series on life sciences and technology leaders. Before we start the show, I would like to remind our viewers that from time to time, financial issues relating to life sciences matters or companies may be discussed on the show. These discussions are not and should not be viewed as financial advice. Moreover, since the show is recorded and shown at multiple times in the future, these discussions may no longer be current. You should always speak with your financial advisor before entering into any financial transaction. We have a terrific guest this afternoon, and before I bring him out, though, I do want to remind our viewers that if you have a question that you would like us to answer on a future show, watch this short video to see how you do it.
You can have your questions answered on Money Matters. Please go to our website, money-matterstv.com. On our homepage, click on the banner on the right that says, Send us your questions. While you're on our website, you can find information about our host and guests, as well as show notes and links about this show and past shows. Money Matters is also available as a podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, so you can listen to Money Matters while you're on the go. That website address, again, is money, M-O-N-E-Y, -matters, M-A-T-T-E-R-S, TV.com.
It's with great pleasure that I welcome our special guest this afternoon, Dr. Nikej Shah. Dr. Shah is the CEO and founder of Nirsum Labs, whose mission is to make addiction curable. Nirsum believes opioid addiction is the most significant neglected public health crisis the U.S. has faced in a generation. The company is developing its lead compound to treat it, as well as to treat alcohol addiction. Dr. Shah is the co-inventor of Nirsum's lead molecule, as well as the principal investigator on Nirsum's cooperative agreement with the National Institutes of Health and the National Institute on Drug Abuse. He brings over 25 years of experience in various roles as a physician scientist, entrepreneur, and investor. He's also the founder and managing partner of biotech-focused investment firm Mountain Brook Capital, through which he is the majority owner of Nirsum. Prior to founding Nirsum, he was a senior healthcare portfolio manager at Sigma Capital Management, now Point72, and at HBK Capital Management. He was also a managing director at Great Point Partners and an analyst at Ursus Capital. Dr. Shah earned his undergraduate degree at Cornell University and his medical degree at NYU School of Medicine. Early in his career, he was practicing emergency physician, having completed his residency at the New York University Bellevue Hospital Center, where he gained extensive experience with the acute treatment and referral of patients with opioid use disorder, or OUD, and alcohol use disorder, or AUD. Dr. Shah, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Tell us about Nirsum Labs.
Sure. So I founded Nirsum in 2017 with really the mission of developing a drug for what I perceived as this enormous unmet medical need, opioid addiction. At the time, and this remains true, there were really only 3 drugs that were approved for this huge problem. And really only 1 drug that helped patients who wanted to completely recover and be abstinent. And I was an investor at the time in the company that was marketing that drug. And I realized that there was one major deficiency, and that's patients couldn't remain on therapy for very long. The median duration on therapy with that drug, and the name is Vivitrol, is about 28 days, which is just not long enough for patients to be able to recover. And so I had a thought in my head that we needed a better drug. I didn't have a drug, I didn't have a technology. I just kind of had an idea and just kind of a sense of purpose back then. So a lot has happened since then, but that's kind of how Nirsum got started.
Okay. And what are your principal areas of focus today?
Yeah. Well, today, fast forward today to 2024, and we actually ended up inventing a drug called NRS-033, which we have a patent, a composition of matter patent on. And we managed to get, at this point, roughly $30 million in non-dilutive funding through the NIH to help develop that drug. We've taken it all the way from really conception through IND-enabling studies and are now completing a phase 1 human clinical trial. So we are what you would call a mid-stage clinical company. We're going into phase 2 clinical testing at this point. And we've done, large-scale manufacturing. So we're, we've made a bit of progress since the early days.
Can you just stepping back a little bit to your initial answer? Can you talk a little bit about the problem in greater detail? Why the fact that the 28 days, I guess,
Yeah.
that was not sufficient to meet the needs of the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the nature of addiction generally, and certainly opioid addiction specifically, is that while it's a chronic disease, it's not an incurable disease. So, there's this general perception out there that addiction, that once somebody's an addict, they're always an addict. And that it's basically an incurable condition. And that's simply false. What it is a difficult condition to overcome, but it is definitely not an incurable condition. What it requires is time away from the triggers of the addiction. So I'll give you a very important example. In the early 1970s, there were a number of men who were serving in Vietnam, and something like 20% of Vietnam vets that were returning to the United States were addicted to heroin at the time. The government was extremely worried about there being an opioid crisis at that time from these returning vets. So they commissioned a study from a famous researcher named Lee Robbins to follow Vietnam vets and to see what became of their addiction in Vietnam once they returned to a different environment for a longer period of time, back to the United States, back home. And everyone had hypothesized, once an addict, always an addict, and addiction is incurable. Everyone had hypothesized, the conventional thinking was, these men are going to come back and they're going to have disastrous lives, and they're all going to be, addicted to heroin, and that's going to create a problem back here in the United States. And shockingly, what ended up happening is that only about 5% of those men in the first year used heroin, and something like only about 12% over the ensuing 3 years. And this was a huge study of thousands and thousands of men. In fact, it was the largest prospective study on opioid addiction that's ever been done. And so that study convincingly showed one thing, which is that when you remove people with enough time and space from the triggers of their addiction, there's a decay, and those habits can go away. But you need to have the time and the space to change the people, places, things, and context of the addiction, and then you'll see the degradation of the addiction. The problem with the therapies that are available today is that while they work well while the patients are on them, they don't work for long enough, so that a patient who has opioid addiction is not able to have sufficient time and space away from their addiction to change the people, places, and things, and the context and the triggers that set off their addictive behaviors. So an ideal therapeutic would be one that gives them that same level of efficacy, but that lasts much longer. So, in the addiction space, not like every other space, but really in the addiction space, efficacy is largely a function of retention on therapy. And so that's the problem, the most important problem that we are looking to solve.
Okay. So just talking about the study that was done on the returning Vietnam soldiers, and I guess comparing it to the issue that you're addressing today with opioid addiction, it seems that those guys at least had one thing that was really helpful to them, which was they were leaving the theater of war and they were coming, hopefully, home to families. So it was dramatic change in probably a significant trigger to their addiction. How can you how do you deal with the fact of people here who are have an opioid addiction, who, I mean, I don't know how long, I mean, if they have to go back to their current environment, how do you avoid those triggers that they might necessarily go back to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is the question. And in fact, right now, relapse rates in the United States for people who are detoxing to abstinence and wanting to recover and no longer be opioid dependent, those relapse rates are something like 91%. Okay. Remember, I told you it's like 5% for these vets that are returning from Vietnam, taking no medications. And here in the United States today in 2024, it's 91% relapse. So that's, why the enormous delta, right? And I think the answer is that what we have to be able to do is have a drug, which we believe NRS 033 is that drug, have a drug that can do pharmaceutically what was done with time, space, and distance for those vets. So they were physically removed thousands of miles away around the earth to go back to, their homes in the United States. They were physically removed from those cues, right?
Right.
And so that's obviously not feasible for most addicts who are here in the United States. So we have a pharmaceutical that makes it impossible for them to get high and feel the effects of opioids, and also diminishes their cravings for opioids for long enough, then they should be able to change the people, places, and things that led to their addiction. In other words, you have an extinguishment now of those cues that previously would incite addictive behaviors. Now, with time and space, you can allow those cues to diminish.
Okay, I'm going to jump around a bit because some more things I wanted to cover about where you are in terms of the clinical trials and so forth. But because of what you just said, I kind of want to hear more about the product that you're developing and how you distinguish it from the product that had that was not successful, the Vivitrol that you mentioned earlier. What distinguishes what you're developing from that product, and how can it be more successful for opioid?
Well, Vivitrol does about $400 million in sales.
So it's not. So that's not that unsuccessful.
It's not that unsuccessful, but it has less than in opioid use disorder. We would estimate that it has less than 5 to 10% penetration into its niche market of patients who want to detox to abstinence and be opioid free. Okay, just in that one niche within opioid use disorder, it has less than 5 to 10% market penetration. So, the biggest competitor that we're going to have is actually not going to be this drug, Vivitrol. It's going to be nothing, right? Because most patients get nothing, right? And so, to answer your question, how does our drug work? Our drug is basically what's called a prodrug, which is a form of an active drug that has been modified to give it certain chemical characteristics. So what our drug does, it's injected into the gluteus muscle, and it releases very, very slowly over time. Vivitrol releases over the course of 28 days and then precipitously wears off. Our drug actually releases very slowly and consistently over many, many months. I don't think we've discussed publicly how many months, but we have said that it's over 400% longer than what we've seen with Vivitrol. So it looks like we have at least a fourfold improvement over what Vivitrol can do in terms of therapeutic coverage. Now, we still have to prove that in clinical trials, but so far, that's what our clinical trials are showing. Additionally, we don't have a precipitous drop-off in our therapeutic effect the way Vivitrol does, which is a frightening problem for Vivitrol, because if you miss a dose, you're now exposed, right? You've been detoxified, you're opioid naive, and if you perchance use again, you're vulnerable to not just relapse, but to overdose. So our drug has sort of a built-in forgiveness. So if a patient misses a dose, if they don't have the bus fare to get to the clinic, or if they're incarcerated, God forbid, or something happens, there's a family emergency and they can't make the visit, they're going to have a much longer period of time than just a couple of days to make it in for the repeat injection. So, we like to say that the NRS-033 has the potential, if we prove it to be the case, to be longer acting, stronger also against opioids, as well as more accessible. So we think it could be longer acting, stronger, safer actually as well, and more accessible. I say safer because if you miss a dose, we can still, you're still getting therapeutic effect until some reasonable period of time after that.
I see. Well, that's extremely beneficial. But so you say you have to prove. So obviously you're just about through your phase 1 clinical studies, and you have phase 2 and phase 3 to go. When we had originally spoken, what you're working on is not a brand new drug, but it is a drug that existed, and you're enhancing it, repurposing it. I don't know if I'm using the right terminology.
Yeah, that's fine.
But tell me what you're doing with it exactly.
Yeah. So one of the unique things about our company is that we have the patent protection and novelty of innovative clinical effect on the patient of a brand new molecular entity, but we have a much lower risk profile because our active pharmaceutical ingredient, our active metabolite, is a drug that's called nalmefene, which is already FDA approved and been approved by the Japanese healthcare authorities in Australia and in Europe. So it's a well-known molecule, nalmefene itself. Our drug is a prodrug of nalmefene. So our drug goes into the body as NRS-033, and then over time it metabolizes and turns into nalmefene. Now, the safety and efficacy of nalmefene is very well documented. Like I said, it's been FDA approved for a long time. So we know a lot about what's going to happen with nalmefene. So in many ways, we have a lower risk biopharmaceutical profile than a company that might be inventing a brand new way of doing things with all the mechanistic risk. I mean, usually in biopharmaceuticals, the chances are about 1 in 1,000 from the time a drug is conceived and synthesized and discovered to the time it has the potential to make it to market. Fortunately for us, the odds are much better at this point, especially because we're already in clinical trials. But even from the get-go, the odds are better for this way of doing things because some of the script has already been written.
And many of our guests that are starting with a brand new drug, for example, I mean, to get through clinical trials could be as long as 7 to 10 years. You might have is it fair for me to say that it could be a shorter run rate, for you to get through clinical trials than 7 to 10 years because of the fact that there is this FDA approved that nalmefene is a component, or this is a
derivative? It depends, to be honest with you. I think in our case, and in many cases, it really depends upon whether or not and to what extent you can leverage what's called the 505(b)(2) pathway for FDA approval. And without getting into unnecessary technical details, I think our timelines, unfortunately, are not going to be that different from the 7 to 10 years that's spent from conception to FDA approval. We're going to have to do phase 2 trials and a phase 3 study and so on and so forth.
Okay. All right. So tell me what, you said there's not really a competitive product on the market. Uh, what is out there, and what is it? And have we covered what distinguishes your product from what's currently out there? Is it the fact that it is the timeline and the forgiving aspect
Yeah.
of the drug?
Yeah, in the opioid use disorder space, particularly for the abstinence-seeking patients, um, the major competitor would be Vivitrol. In the alcohol use disorder space, actually, the major competitor is also Vivitrol because the drug has an indication for both of those diseases, or has indications for both of those diseases, OUD and AUD, alcohol use disorder. And in both instances, the problem is the same. The median duration on therapy is approximately 28 days, which is just not long enough to overcome the triggers of addiction. And so there are, within OUD, there are other drugs that are approved for opioid maintenance, like buprenorphine and methadone. That's a different sort of treatment. That's something called harm reduction, where patients remain opioid dependent, but on safer and more monitored levels of opioids. And in alcohol use disorder, there are pills like acamprosate, the disulfiram. All of these therapies, however, are decades old, and they have problems with either restriction of distribution or side effects or retention on therapy, compliance, so on and so forth. So despite the scale of the epidemic that we have both in alcohol and in OUD, this has been an area that has really been neglected and a severe unmet medical need. And I would very much liken it to, these are the dark ages, frankly, that we're living in for addiction from a medical science point of view. I would liken it to, say, depression prior to the 1950s innovations in antidepressant therapies, or antipsychotics prior to the 1950s innovations. Today, people routinely admit that they're on antidepressants or antipsychotics. It's not really a thing to be ashamed about. You also saw with HIV prior to, say, 1995, there were not very many therapies available. It was a very much stigmatized indication. People were dying of HIV and as AIDS, all the time. And since then, there's been something like 70 new therapies approved for HIV. And at this point, somebody with HIV has almost a normal life expectancy and almost a normal quality of life. And so the history of medicine has shown that diseases can exist in sort of a dark ages until real innovation can come about that can really impact the efficacy of a therapeutic. And that can bring patients who are otherwise reluctant to seek care. You can see one more example, obesity, right? In 2020, there were about 4 or 5 drugs approved for obesity, and they had cumulatively about 1.5% market share. In other words, they had penetrated this. 40% of Americans, like 100 million or so Americans, are clinically obese, yet prior to 2020, only about 1.5% ever got an obesity drug. Then in 2021, semaglutide, also known as Wegovy or Ozempic, was FDA approved, and I don't need to tell you what happened from there. With greater efficacy comes penetration into markets, whether it's going to be depression, obesity, schizophrenia, and in the future, we think it's going to be addiction as well.
So you're reasonably confident that if you're able to develop this drug, that there, you won't have a barrier, since this has been neglected for so long, you won't have a barrier to entry into the market because you think it'll be well received and people will want it if it's available and can do what you
Well,
hope.
there's always barriers, right? There's barriers for for all those diseases that I mentioned. They all had to face some barriers. So we're sober about the about the commercialization challenges that all pharmaceutical companies have to face. But in the end, if you're doing what's right for patients, if you're giving them efficacy that was previously not available, if you're taking a patient who had a 91% chance of relapse, who wants to recover, and significantly improving their chances of recovery, then you're providing something to them that is of value. And I think just like say the obesity space, which was largely an untapped field, until the second generation GLP-1 drugs became available. Just like that space, if we can provide efficacy to patients, we're going to draw them to seek treatment.
Okay. What would success look like for Nirsum?
I think the biggest thing that I would like to see happen is, as a consequence of developing a drug that is truly more efficacious, if we saw removal of the stigma that currently occupies these diseases. Right now, there's a lot of shame, unfortunately, associated with these diseases. Again, like depression, schizophrenia, HIV, even obesity, not that long ago. But when a drug comes around that's able to really impact patients' lives, that really has efficacy, then that has the effect of diminishing the stigma that used to exist. And so I would like to see Nirsum have the sort of impact on patients that is so profound that we don't think of addiction as a character failing, as many people do right now in society, just as they did about obesity 5 or 6 years ago. But instead, think of it as a disease that can be cured.
Okay. Just taking this back to the personal for a second. Tell me a little bit, and we don't have a whole lot of time. Tell me a little bit about how your background in emergency medicine and then your background as an investor in this space helped prepare you to be a founder and a CEO of this company.
Well, I mean, my background as an investor, and I was fortunate enough to be a hedge fund manager for about 15 years. That gave me the business acumen, I think, and the basic business knowledge to know how to run a company. I wouldn't have known that just when I was a doctor. But it was really my life as an emergency room doctor that I think inspired me ultimately to end up where I am. I remember in the hospital that I worked at most of the time, at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, there was a real kind of distinction between how patients with opioid and alcohol addiction were treated versus other patients. If you came in with a broken leg or a gunshot wound or a heart attack, there was genuine empathy from the treatment from the staff, right? Mm-hmm. But when someone came in that was an alcoholic or an opioid addict, there was always like this sort of eye roll, this sense of like hopelessness about this patient, a sort of indignation towards them that I always found kind of puzzling. And it prompted me to look into this study that I told you about, by Lee Robbins, that showed that this is not at all a hopeless disease, addiction.
Nikej, my apologies, but because we're just about out of time, I'm going to cut you off there. But I understand that, the lack of respect for those patients as compared to others. Listen, we could probably go for a full other show, and I really appreciate your being here today. I'd like to thank our special guest today, Nikej Shah. Our next guest on Money Matters is, let me see if I can find it here. The next guest on Money Matters is, Justin Capitola, managing partner of Bluebell Private Wealth Management, LLC. Thank you all for watching and listening this afternoon, and we'll see you again next time.